will hold.
Put the pneumonia on it.
Huh?
Put the pneumonia.
Okay, Erev Tov, everyone. Chodesh Tov. Chodesh. So we started talking last night, looking at this Tshuva of Tzitz Eliezer. It was written a little bit shortly after the 6-day war, talking about when to give thanks and how to give thanks, etc. So it's interesting. I'll just share with you over the last day. So there have been quite a number of somewhat spontaneous initiatives in order to give thanks along these lines. So I saw today somebody sent me a sign that was hanging up in the Mir Yeshiva. I'll read it to you. It says like this. It says Hoda'ah, announcement. V'hoda'ah leborei olam al hanisim hagdolim hagluim v'nistalim shezachu lehem bnei Eretz Yisrael b'eit ha'achrona. In thanks to Hashem for all the great miracles, the revealed and the hidden miracles that we've had in the recent times. Uv'vakasha b'tfilah lishvat haklal v'aprat, and to give thanks for the past, to give in bakasha for the future as well. Titkayem yetz Hashem tfilat rabim v'amarat nishmat kol chai. Okay, it's already been. So if anybody thought they were going to go to the Mir to participate, that was this afternoon in the Mir Yeshiva. So I thought that was interesting. This is not, and there are certain announcements coming out, certain Yeshuvim and certain Yeshivot that announce that tomorrow they'll be saying Halal Shalem. We're saying Halal with the bracha, right? But we say Halal B'diluk because Rosh Chodesh. There's a whole discussion to add in the prakim, not add in the prakim, etc. I know there's a tefillah tomorrow morning at the Kotel as well, in the presence of the chief rabbis and others, again, to give a hoda'ah. Interesting there, the announcement for the Kotel said halal v'hoda'ah. It did not specify what they would be saying in the halal or if they were adding in extra prakim. I think that was intentional. But anyway, so so we started seeing last night from the Tzitz Eliezer. So he writes after the 6-day war, he says, now is not the time to add in an additional halal. It was very interesting. We saw one reason he said is because you still have meitim mutalim lefanenu. There are people who died in the war. There is still, alongside the celebration and jubilation, there is still tragedy and there's still mourning. And it's not appropriate now to add in an additional to establish a new halal. He says maybe that's when it came to Nes Chanukah. He says that's what maybe the pshat when it says Leshana Achelet Kvaum, that they did not establish Chanukah of halal and hoda'ah in that year. They established it in a subsequent year. It's interesting. Shana Acheret, we don't actually know. Does it mean the next year? Does it mean a number of years later? We don't know that. It's not completely clear. And different interpretations and different reasons are given amongst the Mefarshim. Why was it only L'Shana Acheret? Says the Tzitz Eliezer suggests maybe it was L'Shana Acheret because that year they were still dealing with the losses from the war. Okay, so that's one reason that he gives. Why? He says you should not establish a new halal, but he says in the halal that we're already saying on Rosh Chodesh, as we did this morning, and tomorrow morning it's Friday, so we have even more time. We can maybe even sing two prakim, right? That's we have in mind for the nisim and the niflaot that we have experienced in our days. Again, we could talk about this. We could talk about this for a long time, but there are so many things. Just one example, which everybody knows. But there was the one of the rockets which landed, which there was a direct hit on Soroka Hospital. Right, we were here. There was one of the days shul was open. We were davening, and while we were here, that was the day when we came back to shul, and there was an azakah while we were davening. We started davening in the miklat, and there was a direct hit on Soroka. And miraculously, to the best of my knowledge, nobody was killed. I'm not sure there were even any injuries. But the building that it hit, so the night before, the nurses of the hospital said they should evacuate that building. There was no instruction, there was no order from higher up that they had to, but they felt a bit. There was whatever it was. But the point is that they decided that I know that after that happened, hospitals were doing different things. They were moving into underground parking lots and all sorts of things. But that building was moved the day before. Nobody knew. Nobody had inside information that an Iranian rocket was going to land on that building. But it just so happened that the building that was evacuated the day before was the one where the rocket hit. And had it not been, right, we shudder to think what could have been. So that's just one example. There are many, many, many examples of the miracles. So the first reason he says L'Shana Acheret, right, as we've explained. And then he says, the Tzitz Eliezer continues. He says, why should we have in mind the halal of Rosh Chodesh and not to establish a different day? He says, this whole practice of establishing now a day, establishing a new date in the calendar to mark something is not so straightforward. As we all know from the arguments about Yom HaTzmaot and Yom Yerushalayim, and there are different opinions in the poskim, but I'll read you what the Tzitz Eliezer says. So he says like this, Shenit, ואומרים להסמיך ולכלול ההודעה ליום ראש חודש סמוך, כוונתי בזה בדרך כלל, להסמיך ולכלול ההלל והודאה ביום מועד קבוע ועומד. He says, if we can, to attach the Hallel and Hoda'ah, the Thanksgiving, to a day which we already have established, so that it's better. Why? So he bases that on. First of all, he says, we find the opposite. When it comes to adding on days of mourning, we generally try not to add on days as well. He quotes the Kinah from Tisha B'Av, where we say, Ein nosif moed sheva v'tavela ve'en lakdim zorati l'achela, which means, רצונו בזה שעל כן קבעו לבכות ולספוד על הרוגי שפילה ואלמייזה שנהרגו בחודשי אייר וסיוון ביום תשעה באב, ולא קבעו יום מיוחד על כך, מפני שאין להוסיף מועד. So he says there are those communities in Europe that were destroyed going back many centuries, but we don't have a different day on the calendar. We do have Avarachamim that we say on Shabbat morning, which we say the Avarachamim and certain in the months of Iyar and Sivan, even Shabbos Avarachim, we say it, even though we don't normally say it because of all the tragedies that took place. But we don't have an extra day in the calendar. We add those things on to Tisha B'Av. So he says, on the other way around, if it comes to adding in extra days of Yamim Tovim, okay, again, I know that there are other opinions on this, and it's a long discussion, but that's what he says. First of all, it's more straightforward to establish from a separate day that we already have, and to add in a new day. He bases this on the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah. The Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, which discusses Megillat Ta'anit, spoken in the past, that we have what's called Megillat Ta'anit, certain days. Primarily these were days that were connected to different events that took place in the Beit HaMikdash, and sort of quasi Yom Tov. There's a list of these days on which there is no Hesped and there is no Ta'anit, and these are sort of Yom Tov days. And the Gemara there has a discussion, and the Gemara says that we no longer have Megillat Ta'anit. These were all, once the Beit HaMikdash was destroyed, we don't celebrate these days anymore, with the notable exception of Purim and Chanukah. So he says, the Gemara says, Kamaita bitul, achaniyata musifim. Says if you've nullified, you've cancelled the ones that were originally there, how are you now going to come and add on extra days as well? Okay, there are those who say that that's only related to the Beit HaMikdash, but if it's got something that's nothing to do with that, something else, then we could add. But anyway, that's the so that's one source which he brings. Okay, and then he brings another interesting discussion when it comes to Hallel, and these are two things which are brought and discussed in the context of Chanukah, in the context of Purim as well. First, he quotes the Chidah. So the Chidah says that although in the Gemara we find Takanat Nevi'im Lama Hallel al Kol Tzara Shelo Tavo V'Nitzlu, the Gemara Pesachim says that the Nevi'im, prophets, made a takana that any time there is a great tzara, a great distress that comes to the Jewish people and they are saved from it, that we say Hallel. So the Chidah writes about that. He says, that is when this is something which applies to the entire Jewish people. So again, there are many things which have been written about this. Not everybody agrees with this point of the Chidah, but so then the question becomes, if it's saying for the entire Jewish people, so then they say, what about Chanukah? So he writes over there the following. He says, the next Chanukah, Shani. וכיוון שהיו רוצים להחליף בית המקדש, צרת כל ישראל מקרי, וכיוון שלא נחלף הצרת כל ישראל מקרי. It says over there that when it comes to Chanukah, that since they wanted to destroy the Beit HaMikdash, that is considered like it's for the entire Jewish people. That's considered like the entire Jewish people are saved. Of course, in our days, when it comes to this discussion comes up by, I think we spoke about it once, but it comes up by Yom HaTzmaut as well. So there are those who wanted to argue and say this is the reason why, if we go along with this, to say you can't say Hallel on Yom HaTzmaut because it's something that didn't necessarily affect the entire Jewish people, it just affected those who were living in Eretz Yisrael at the time. So two answers to that. One is that, who says, when we talk about the entire Jewish people, feel like this, who says that the people in Chutz La'aretz count, right? And we find, and you laugh, but there are, for certain halachic sugyas, right, the Rambam writes regarding certain korbanot and regarding certain halachot, which I'm not going to get into now, but where we call Rov Yisrael or Kol Yisrael, we relate to the Jewish people that are living in Eretz Yisrael. So it could be that when we say Kol Yisrael, we're just talking about the Jewish people in all of Israel, in the land of Israel. But even if you say, no, we want to include everybody, so again, it's hard to argue that the events that took place in 1948. It's hard to argue that the events that take place now don't affect the entire Jewish people, even those that are living outside and those that are waiting to come back on by plane or tugboat or whatever it may be. So that's one point. So he writes here, in any event, so he says, "Misof divrei hachaim shal," which is the chida. He says, I find in his words also there is a precedent for not to establish a new day necessarily, but again to place it, to attach it onto a day which you're already marking. And he quotes a case over here where there was a certain distress and they were saved. And what did they do? He says, says over there, the establishment was to say, essentially the mizmor of Halel HaGadol, which is Kilo Lam Chasto, which is what we already say every Shabbat morning. It says, to say it, not just to mumble it, but to say it and to sing it in a nice way. He says over there, he says they didn't establish a new halal, but they established to say the halal that we're already saying, to say it with a little bit more kavanah and a little bit more intent. Okay, so he says, in other words, the point is, as I said last night, right, we're in a situation that certainly calls for thanksgiving, certainly calls for hoda'ah, certainly calls for us to wake up and take notice and express thanks in some way. So adding on extra tefillot or adding on extra days or doing something new is not so straightforward. But the things that we already do every day, we have a Psukei Zimra, we say Psukei Zimra is called halal. It's called halal by the Gemara. Certainly the perek of Kilo Lam Chasto, that is called halal HaGadol, and certainly it would be appropriate to have extra things in mind, as we said by the halal of Rosh Chodesh as well. Okay, there's one other point which is interesting to mention as well, which is the Maratz Chayut. And the Maratz Chayut says when they established halal, there's another criteria which needs to be, which is that it's only on a nes which is supernatural, not a nes which takes place in terms of in nature, but it has to be something. And he proves this. Well, he wants to suggest this. Why? Based on the Gemara about Chanukah. The Gemara by Chanukah says, "My Chanukah." What is Chanukah? And Rashi over there says, "An eze nes kavua," over which miracle was it established? And you ask the question, what do you mean of which miracle was it established? Everybody knows what happened on Chanukah, Matimu, Rabim, etc., the whole war, etc. Everybody knows. Why do we have to ask the question, "My Chanukah"? So he explains that it's over there. The question is over which nes. If it had just been a milchama and just been a war, which was derech hateva, and again, as much as we say, you look back, if you're objective and if you're honest about it, you look back what's happened over the last 2 weeks, to say that it's just, if you look at that and say that's just b'derech hateva and there's no nisim, so good luck to you. I don't know how you can explain it that way. But he says it was just a milchama, so that was just something which was k'derech hateva, and therefore we wouldn't be able to say necessarily halal on that. So the question was, what's the nes? What's the supernatural miracle which took place? It says that was nes pachat shemen, and therefore we could go and therefore we could establish the extra days of halal as well. Again, that's the Maratz Chayut. As I mentioned, this discussion comes up by Yom Ha'atzmaut. Not everybody agrees. It's not clear in any of the sources that that's when the Gemara says the tzakana was al kol tzara v'tzara shtavo. It doesn't say that it has to be a supernatural salvation. How do you define natural? How do you define supernatural, etc.? Okay, but these are some of the questions, and these are some of the points that he raises. Bottom line, the Tzitz Eliezer, at least at this point, says we're not happy, we're not ready right now to establish a new halal, to establish a new day necessarily, but we should attach, we can and we should attach the Thanksgiving to the halal, to the existing days that we already have. Rabbi Chananya ben Akash Omer, Tzakadosh Baruch Hu lezakot Yisrael, lefachach haba lahem Torah mitzvot, shnei ha'adonai chavetz